Section 66, Part 3, Chapter 3, continued, of The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, by Vicente Blasco Ibáñez, translated by Charlotte Brewster Jordan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In the sweep of plains unrolled before them, not a man was visible. It seemed like a country Sunday, when the farmers are in their homes and the land scene lying in silent meditation. Some shapeless objects could be seen in the fields, like agricultural implements deserted for a day of rest. Perhaps they were broken automobiles or artillery carriages destroyed by the force of their volleys. "This way," said the officer, who had added 4 soldiers to the party to carry the various bags and packages which Desnoyers had brought out on the roof of the automobile. They proceeded in a single file the length of a wall of blackened bricks, down a steep hill. After a few steps, the surface of the ground was about to their knees, further on up to their waists, and thus they disappeared within the earth, seeing above their heads only a narrow strip of sky. They were now under the open field, having left behind them the mass of ruins that hid the entrance of the road. They were advancing in an absurd way, as though they scorned direct lines, in zigzags, in curves, in angles. Other pathways, no less complicated, branched off from this ditch, which was the central avenue of an immense subterranean cavity. They walked and walked and walked. A quarter of an hour went by, a half an entire hour. Lacour and his friend thought longingly of the roadways flanked with trees, of their tramp in the open air where they could see the sky and meadows. They were not going 20 steps in the same direction. The official marching ahead was every moment vanishing around a new bend. Those who were coming behind were panting and talking unseen, having to quicken their steps in order not to lose sight of the party. Every now and then they had to halt in order to unite and count the little band, to make sure that no one had been lost in a transverse gallery. The ground was exceedingly slippery, in some places almost liquid mud, white and caustic like the drip from the scaffolding of a house in the course of construction. The thump of their footsteps and the friction of their shoulders brought down chunks of earth and smooth stones from the sides. Little by little they climbed through the main artery of this underground body and the veins connected with it. Again they were near the surface, where it required but little effort to see the blue above the earthworks. But here the fields were uncultivated, surrounded with wire fences, yet with the same appearance of Sabbath calm. Knowing by sad experience what curiosity oftentimes cost, the official would not permit them to linger here. "Keep right ahead. Forward march!" For an hour and a half the party kept doggedly on, until the senior members became greatly bewildered and fatigued by their serpentine meanderings. They could no longer tell whether they were advancing or receding, the sudden steeps and the continual turning bringing on an attack of vertigo. "Have we much further to go?" asked the senator. "There," responded the guide, pointing to some heaps of earth above them. There was a bell tower, surrounded by a few charred houses that could be seen a long ways off, the remains of a hamlet which had been taken and retaken by both sides. By going in a direct line on the surface, they would have compassed this distance in half an hour. To the angles of the underground road, arranged to impede the advance of an enemy, there had been added the obstacles of campaign fortification, tunnels cut with wire lattice work, large hanging cages of wire which, on falling, could block the passage and enable the defenders to open fire across their gratings. They began to meet soldiers with packs and pails of water, who were soon lost in the tortuous crossroads. Some, seated on piles of wood, were smiling as they read a little periodical published in the trenches. The soldiers stepped aside to make way for the visiting procession, bearded and curious faces peeping out of the alleyways. Afar off sounded a crackling of short snaps as though at the end of the winding lanes were a shooting lodge where a group of sportsmen were killing pigeons. The morning was still cloudy and cold. In spite of the humid atmosphere, a buzzing like that of a horsefly hummed several times above the two visitors. "Bullets," said their conductor laconically. Desnoyers, meanwhile, had lowered his head a little. He knew perfectly well that insectivorous sound. The senator walked on more briskly, temporarily forgetting his weariness. They came to a halt before a lieutenant colonel who received them like an engineer exhibiting his workshops, like a naval officer showing off the batteries and turrets of his battleships. He was the chief of the battalion occupying this section of the trenches. Don Marcelo studied him with special interest, knowing that his son was under his orders. To the two friends, these subterranean fortifications bore a certain resemblance to the lower parts of a vessel. They passed from trench to trench of the last line, the oldest, dark galleries into which penetrated streaks of light across the loopholes and broad, low windows of the mitrailleuse. The long line of defense formed a tunnel cut by short, open spaces. They had to go stumbling from light to darkness and from darkness to light, with a visual suddenness very fatiguing to the eyes. The ground was higher in the open spaces. There were wooden benches placed against the sides so that the observers could put out the head or examine the landscape by means of the periscope. The enclosed space answered both for batteries and sleeping quarters. As the enemy had been repelled and more ground had been gained, the combatants who had been living all winter in these first quarters had tried to make themselves more comfortable. Over the trenches in the open air, they had laid beams from the ruined houses. Over the beams, planks, doors and windows, and on top of the wood, layers of sacks of earth. These sacks were covered by a top of fertile soil from which sprouted grass and herbs, giving the roofs of the trenches an appearance of pastoral placidity. The temporary arches could thus resist the shock of the abuses which went plowing into the earth without causing any special damage. When an explosive was pounding too noisily and weakening the structure, the troglodytes would swarm out in the night like watchful ants and skillfully readjust the roof of their primitive dwellings. Everything appeared clean with that simple and rather clumsy cleanliness exercised by men living far from women and thrown upon their own resources. The galleries were something like the cloisters of a monastery, the corridors of a prison, and the middle sections of a ship. Their floors were a half-yard lower than that of the open spaces which joined the trenches together. In order that the officers might avoid so many ups and downs, some planks had been laid, forming a sort of scaffolding from doorway to doorway. End of section 66.